Georgia was very unique and different from the other colonies prior to becoming the fourth state of the Union. So let's delve more into that. Welcome to Tingledom. First Monday of the month. It's always so great around here. We've got everybody coming and going in what we call the Edwina room now. I'm sure you know your way up there, just 3rd floor. Yeah. No, I haven't done my session yet today, but I can't wait to find out about Georgia. I'm sure you'll love it. Now, I did get a little bit more word from Edwina. She said as an enticement for you, she has been thinking for a long time that you should become an adorer of Tingledom officially. And she thought that because she knew you would be obsessed with the idea of the 7 days of maps, that if you become an adorer, then she will definitely do the 7 days of maps with you. So, she make it official. She's a mysterious woman, has her own ways. But I think, well, I don't actually know anybody else who knows about the 7 days of maps, because I only told you. And I'm trying to think where I first heard about it. And I'm thinking now, I think I saw it written down on a piece of paper. And so now I'm thinking that Edwina actually left that, so then I would tell you. But Edwina will be waiting for you with lots of amazing expertise and facts to tell you all about Georgia. Why don't you head on up? Oh, it's so good to see you again. Oh, wonderful. So excited to share with you how we got to the state of Georgia and how it looks right now, which of course means the colony of Georgia and everything that went before. But first I just wanted to check, did I tell you about, I'm running this really exclusive series called 7 Days of Maps. Yeah, so I'm doing each day where I will take you through a different time period of North America and the geography and how that's happened. That focuses a little bit less as much on the political history and such as what's happening at that point, and a bit more on mapping techniques and how they got to mapping and that sort of thing. Yeah, no, so you should definitely check it out. It's awesome. I'm really excited to share it with you all. Just had the idea after I started these sessions, I thought I'd really like to share that with you. But anyway, let's get on to Georgia. So Georgia is actually quite an interesting case because unlike our previous colonies that we've looked at so far, you know, they had this real Dutch-Swedish touch. Georgia, completely different sort of history. So this comes from almost 50 years before Georgia was created. And this is the Nouvelle Carte de la Caroline. And you can see it's French. And it wasn't. So you have the Carolinas and then the area of Georgia would be down this way. And at that point, France was a bit more coming up the Mississippi, so a bit more over here rather than particularly as well because down south in Florida, that was where Spain was. But Spain had actually emerged into the area of present-day Georgia, not with settlements, but with missions. They were out and trying to convert Native Americans over to their religions. And so they were focusing on the Gaul Native Americans, and so they had missions dotted throughout here. But the Spanish actually had a number of missions. They were quite expansive. But so the strategy and the need for a colony and the parameters were very different than the colonies that we looked at thus far. Georgia is sitting right next to Florida, just by Spain, and as I said, and then France were on the other side of the Mississippi River. Georgia is also unique in that it was created not as a proprietorship or anything like that. It was a royal colony from the beginning, and it was run by trustees. And what was really unique about these trustees is that they were not allowed to have any land in the colony. And so Georgia was administered by basically English government, so it was across the sea, where all of the edicts and governing at large principles came down, and it wasn't administered locally, which did cause some problems with the people there. Now, there are two schools of thought on what it was created for. So one of the major trustees for Georgia was John Oglethorpe, and he came over with the first set of colonists and was, key in helping set it up and everything like that. His history back in England, where he gained notoriety, was he was a gentleman, and he had a friend who'd been thrown into debtor's prison. His friend ended up dying in prison, and so this made Oglethorpe think that they perhaps needed to investigate the conditions of the prisons. And he really shone a light on the conditions for people and led to many debtors being set free, and really advocated for people being able to pay their debts by working outside of prison rather than inside prison. And so when he first conceived of a colony, I think he thought that it should be a place where these debtors would be able to come, so people who had been in the unfortunate poor, let them come and create a better life for themselves. But part of the problem with that came that strategically, the reason that Britain really wanted to create a colony in this area, there had actually been a few different proposals for colonies in the Georgia area. South Carolina really wanted there to be a buffer between them and Spain, so they wouldn't be copying the brunt of everything. And so they were really happy for there to be another colony. And so while there's somewhat of this history of it being a charity colony, there's not actually much evidence that very many debtors actually came over. It definitely, in the end, was primarily a defensive colony. And that led to some important pieces of the puzzle for how it emerged for them. When they were selecting colonists, They didn't necessarily choose soldiers, however, because soldiers were not looked upon as very good. They wanted to have this moral society. They were looking to recruit a particular type of settler. The soldiers didn't meet their specifications, I suppose. And so, but part of that was they established 3 main laws before they had arrived and sent settlers there. And these were driven by Oglethorpe. One was that they couldn't have rum. So he thought that rum was the cause of lots of ills. And when people were dying of sickness and that sort of thing, he was always blaming it on rum. The second was that they could have no African slaves. So African slaves were very common in South Carolina, and he didn't want it to become a colony that was dependent on slave labor. While we may look back and think, maybe that's rather nice, it was more of a consideration of the type of colony he wanted to create because of the needs for having defenses and that sort of thing. He thought that if the population was too many African slaves, that it would not be good for defense. So it was more of a strategic than a moral position. And then the third had to do with how much land one person could own, because again they wanted to raise significant numbers, and so they wanted a lot of people to be able to come down and get land. So we have a wonderful series of maps to go through from here. The next is one of my favorite styles of map. So it was 1732 when Georgia was finally declared, and it was named Georgia for King George II, who was the one who declared it. So just named for him. Very simple name. And so the space for it, which we'll get to in a moment, so is the area between the headwaters of the Savannah and Altamaha River. And then the western bound was supposed to be the South Seas, which is the Pacific, which is supposed to be parallel lines running from there. Which is pretty crazy, and we have a map that does actually go almost halfway to those borders, but we'll get to that. And so that was the bounds of Georgia. Now, obviously, because the French were on the other side of the Mississippi, this wasn't taking that into account. But this here is a very early image of Savannah. So you can see this large cliff area. It was set on this area that was high above so it wouldn't flood. And this was an area that was actually recommended to them by the Native Americans. They had very good relations with the Native Americans right in this area. It was a small band of about 100 people who had kind of been outcasts from their other bands, is the impression I've got from the reading I've done. And so they were quite happy to form good relationships with the British. And you can see it's very linearly laid out. And right here, as we said, being one of the trustees, Oglethorpe couldn't have land. So his tent is pitched right here at the front. And everyone got the same house as well, so everyone just built the same house. and the same blocks. Now, it wasn't a very successful colony. It was primarily created for defense, so it wasn't chosen for the most fertile area. But these areas were chosen for strategic military reasons, for defending the other colonies, in essence. And so farming wasn't that successful, the land wasn't that good, and people liked to drink rum. So there was a lot of rum drinking for the people breaking that prohibition. So we have our new map of the British Empire in America, which we've seen this before. You can just see Georgia listed here. It's not very well bordered out at this point. So in present-day Alabama, the Spanish were claiming land there. But by 1742, that had pretty much been eliminated. There was a really nasty battle with them, led by Oglethorpe. And so they put up no resistance after that defeat that they suffered. Now we have this map. This comes from 1752, a new and accurate map of the provinces of North and South Carolina and Georgia. And this was done by Emmanuel Bowen. And so we can see Georgia delineated here. You have the two rivers, the Altamaha and the Savannah River. So you can see how it's delineated there, and then nothing really showing the borders off to the South Seas at the time. Now, so this is 1752, at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. Then the borders for Georgia were moved in a bit to the Mississippi, so from the Pacific into the Mississippi, because it was established that the French would have the lands west of the Mississippi. This was part of the treaty to finish off that war. At the same time, James Wright, who was the royal governor of Georgia at the time, was given permission to extend the boundary of Georgia down. So rather than being constrained here, that would come down to the end of where Florida was, because that was also arranged there. So basically, the southern border of Georgia became the southern border of the British colonies. Now, this map skips forward a little bit further. This goes to the end of the Revolutionary War, 1784. It's a new and current map of the United States in North America. And this is by Abel Buell. It's a very, very significant map because it was one of the first maps put out after the end of the Revolutionary War. So here we can see Georgia's borders here, and then going all the way to the Mississippi River, as we saw. And we'll get into how that changed in a little bit. Check back to Georgia's involvement in the Revolution. There was a lot of discontent in the colony being administered by these trustees, that they didn't have local representation, that they didn't get to elect their officials. And it was particularly significant because a lot of the other colonies did offer these sort of things. And so they felt like they weren't being fairly represented. And so when there was this growing movement, then they definitely wanted to become a part of it. But what's really interesting is there were writings in Georgia which echoed sentiments that came decades later in Thomas Paine's Common Sense. But these were decades earlier written by people in Georgia, and that's because they were really suffering with this trustee arrangement. Having the government so far removed really had significant impacts on the colony. Interestingly enough, as well, another thing that the colonists were unhappy with was the inability to secure African slaves. So it was never a moral thing, and it was these two competing ideas, because the colonists obviously wanted to be able to make a living or make a fortune, and they felt they couldn't do so without slave labor to be able to compete with the prices that South Carolina and such were getting. And so they were in an awkward position of basically needing slaves to be able to compete on price. But that doesn't really change the moral dimension of owning another human being. So we've talked about the two borders. Obviously, the Savannah River border at the north. Altamaha was at the south, but then that got extended, as we discussed. At the end of the Revolutionary War, there was also a fixing of 31 degrees north as the southern border of the United States. And so that became the southern border of Georgia as well. And then in 1795, there was another treaty with Spain over Florida. And so that, again, settled the border. And that is more the modern border that we see on the southern side. In 1802, Georgia then ceded its lands to the West to pay for its war debt. We talked about this with New York doing so, but Georgia was one of the last states to do so, and they were somewhat forced into it because of a really bad scheme by their General Assembly. They wanted to sell land, and so they had sold this land, but they gave preference to those in the legislature that they could buy it for pennies per acre. And so they bought this land and then were on selling it, and everyone was trying to make money, so it was a huge scandal at the time. And it needed to be sorted out, and so they, in order to kind of make it good, they sold the lands off so that they could raise funds. So that's when they lost all the rest of these lands. And it was really, they were forced into it by their own greed. So then, that was 1802. To finish off the boundaries that we have, in 1818, Kamek, he was a surveyor, and so he was going out trying to survey the northern border. And he calculated that 35 degrees north was not north of Nanjak. And Nanjak was a Native American settlement. Well, his calculations were wrong. So, by modern calculations, we can see that Nanjak was definite, the 35 degrees north was definitely north of Nanjak. But so he then went south of Nanjak and measured there. And he went 110 miles, which wasn't the whole length of the border. Then the following year, he was asked to go and survey the rest of the line. And so he started from the eastern side and was going through, and where he was supposed to come up and meet his previous line, he found that they were off. And so instead of redoing it and getting it right, he just connected the lines, and that has been the border ever since. But Georgia is not happy about that, and they haven't been happy about it for 200 years. Over the past 200 years, there's been dozens of votes by the Georgia Assembly to investigate with Tennessee and South Carolina, which they've never responded to. Even as recently as 2013, they did pass a resolution in regards to this, so it's still an ongoing issue. But it's slight enough. It's 661 yards is how far it's off at that particular point. So in this scale, it's not the most visible. And then Georgia, prior to this time, but became the 4th state to join the Union, the first in 1788 on the 2nd of January. And that is when they then became a state.